On the morning of the 17th of November 1939, the German freighter SS Columbus drifted into British-controlled waters near the Norwegian coast, believing she had encountered nothing more than a routine cross-channel ferry that had somehow wandered far from her normal route. The ship facing her HMS Pjelver looked entirely ordinary. Her outline matched the civilian passenger ferries that only months earlier had carried families and workers between Dover and Calais on peaceful afternoons. Her funnels showed the faded paint of commercial service. Her decks carried the familiar shape of a vessel built for comfort and quiet voyages. Nothing in her appearance suggested danger or deception. Yet in the 6 hours before the Columbus appeared, HMS Pjelver had already deployed 240 Mark 114 mines in a precise grid beneath the surface, each mine resting 12 feet underwater, waiting in silence. The German captain imagined he was passing an innocent ferry, but the water around him had become a trap built with intention. Before he could correct his mistake, before he could turn back to safety, his ship had already crossed the hidden field twice. The blast that followed tore through the Columbus and pulled her under in fewer than 4 minutes. This was not chance. This was the strategy the Royal Navy had been shaping since the first weeks of the war. Between August 1939 and March 1940, Britain converted 36 cross-channel ferries and coastal steamers into secret mine layers vessels, so plain that German intelligence logged them as auxiliary transports and hospital ships. By May 1940, these seemingly harmless ferries had placed 43,367 mines throughout defensive zones around British shores and across offensive routes leading into German shipping paths. German charts marked particular passages as safe, though they were now deadly. Kriegsmarine captains sailed with full confidence, trusting maps that showed clear water, even as they crossed zones seeded with British mines. In the first 9 months of the war, the minefields laid by these converted ferries destroyed 127 German vessels, a number greater than the confirmed sinkings by all British submarines during the same period. German assessments from 1939 show that not a single report correctly identified these ferries as mine layers. Every observation was wrong. What appeared to be Britain repurposing civilian ships out of desperation was in truth one of the most efficient and devastating deceptions of the early war. The operation succeeded because it looked crude. It looked improvised. Conventional naval logic in 1939 insisted that mine warfare demanded purpose-built ships with advanced systems. The German Kriegsmarine-operated vessels designed from their very foundation for mine-laying, such as the Cobra and Kaiser, each featuring stern rails, hydraulic deployment systems, and the ability to maintain 18 knots while dispersing mines with mathematical precision. These ships carried crews trained for years in geometric patterns and navigational calculation. Their hulls were reinforced for the stress of mine operations. French doctrine followed similar thinking. Vessels like the Pluton class carried large plotting rooms and crews of 180 specialists. By contrast, Britain was converting ferries that only weeks earlier had served tea to holiday travelers. HMS Maxman, built from a steam packet ferry from the Isle of Man, still kept pieces of her original saloon furniture in the officer mess. HMS Princess Victoria still had the old ticket booth from her Stranraer to Larne passenger route visible beneath a quick layer of Admiralty grey paint. The conversions were done in an average of 11 days, a stark difference from purpose-built mine layers which required 18 months to construct. Critics inside the Admiralty argued fiercely against the program. Vice Admiral Sir Reginald Henderson wrote in October 1939 that such vessels lacked the structure, the trained crews, and the navigational accuracy required for mine laying. He believed Britain was risking sailors' lives on platforms that were never meant for war. He believed the strategy was reckless. Technically, his points were correct. Structurally, the ferries were weaker. Their crews were not naval experts. Their equipment lacked sophistication. Yet the conclusion he reached was wrong. Those limitations were the very elements that allowed Britain to strike effectively without being seen. A purpose-built mine layer announces itself by design. It looks like a warship. It behaves like a warship. It cannot hide. A converted ferry in contrast blends into the sea lanes as if it had never left peacetime. The Germans saw exactly what they expected to see. They saw ferries doing civilian work. They never looked deeper, and the mines kept falling silently into the water. As HMS Pilver completed her mission long before the Columbus appeared, she demonstrated the philosophy that guided the entire program: appear harmless, operate quietly, strike invisibly. This was the opening chapter of a strategy that would redefine British mine warfare in the first year of the conflict, and reshape the fears, the assumptions, and the operational habits of the German Navy. Britain had taken ships that looked weak and turned them into an invisible weapons system built not from advanced machinery, but from the expectations of the enemy. The critics inside the Admiralty insisted that Britain was risking everything by sending sailors into battle aboard vessels that had spent their former lives carrying tourists and day trippers. They argued that no navy could call this strategy sound. They felt that a war at sea demanded ships built with steel strength and technical complexity. Yet the strategy they condemned was the one that would outwit German intelligence again and again. They missed the deeper truth that every weakness they named was secretly a strength. When Vice Admiral Sir Reginald Henderson wrote that Britain was sending men to sea in passenger boats, and daring to call it naval planning, he was right in every literal sense, but wrong in every practical one. The converted ferries functioned not by following German principles, but by turning those principles upside down. Where the Kriegsmarine invested in heavy purpose-built mine layers with machinery visible from miles away, the Royal Navy deliberately kept the ferries looking exactly as they had in peacetime. Their familiar outlines, their modest speeds, and their soft silhouettes formed a disguise so natural that not even trained observers suspected a thing. German mine layers required 180 men to operate their hydraulic systems, plotting tables, and complex deployment machinery. British conversions managed the same mission with 47 men, most of them merchant sailors, who had lived on these same ships for years before the war. They knew every sound, every vibration, every odd quirk of the engines. Instead of hydraulic rails, British engineers bolted two simple wooden or steel rails directly onto the existing deck planking. These rails held 150 Mark 14 mines on a ship like HMS Minster, each mine weighing over 1,000 pounds. Nothing in the installation was elegant. Nothing was reinforced. There were no specialized mechanisms. At the stern, a single sailor operated a mechanical lever that linked through steel cables to retaining clips. When the officer on the bridge rang the telegraph bell, the man at the stern pulled the lever, a clip snapped free, and the mine rolled down the ramp into the sea. Timing required nothing more than a stopwatch and a careful count. At 12 knots, each release sent a mine dropping into the water, 72 yards apart, forming a pattern roughly 400 yards wide. It was crude at first glance, yet perfectly suited for wartime, where failures in machinery and weather and communications were guaranteed. The British system did not depend on ideal conditions. It required only men paying attention. German mine layers, by contrast, depended on electricity stability and continual communication between bridge plotting room and deck crew. Their tools were excellent but fragile. Britain built tools that could operate in silence in chaos, with half an engine failing, and with sailors who had learned the ship long before they learned the mine. German air reconnaissance unknowingly recorded the success of this philosophy aboard HMS Kelowna in December 1939. From above, the vessel seemed nothing more than a civilian ferry traveling at a modest speed with no escort and no visible armament. German observers confidently labeled her a transport or a low-value auxiliary. But while they photographed her, she was in the middle of her 9th mine, laying run, having already dropped 1,350 mines along enemy routes. She continued placing mines at regular intervals even as German aircraft documented her movement. They saw a ferry, they did not see a mine layer, This disconnect between appearance and purpose became the foundation of British success. German intelligence operated on pattern recognition. A mine layer in their mines must display certain signs. It must move fast. It must operate with escort ships. It must show the sharp angles of a warship hull. It must avoid neutral waters. It must carry visible equipment on deck. The converted ferries did none of these things. They behaved exactly like civilian vessels because that was what they had always been. British operational doctrine sharpened this idea with deliberate rules. Converted ferries never operated in groups. They maintained the same speeds they had used in peace. Those from the Isle of Man traveled at 11 to 12 knots, just as they had for civilian passengers. They kept their running lights in neutral waters. Some retained faded hints of their civilian names beneath the grey paint that had been rolled over them in haste. Every detail reinforced the illusion. In one example, HMS Scotia, a former railway ferry, completed 23 mine-laying missions between September 1939 and April 1940. German reports recorded sightings of civilian ferries in her vicinity 7 times, yet never identified her as anything but harmless traffic. Lieutenant Commander James Harrison, who commanded her, wrote in one after-action report that he passed within 800 yards of a German trawler at dawn. The enemy vessel showed no reaction and continued on its route. Meanwhile, HMS Scotia continued deploying her mines exactly according to plan. The German trawler log, recovered after the war, noted simply that a British passenger ferry had been sighted, likely heading toward Copenhagen. They watched her, but they did not understand what they were watching. German naval analysts later examined captured British mine-laying equipment and were baffled by its simplicity. They assumed the crude mechanisms reflected British weakness. They wrote that British engineering standards must have collapsed because no navy would intentionally operate such basic tools for mine deployment. Yet the truth was that Britain had chosen simplicity because simplicity worked. The British system could operate without electricity or hydraulics or stable engine speeds. The mines would still fall, the pattern would still form, the mission would still succeed. This ability made the ferries unstoppable in conditions that would cripple German vessels. One clear example came on the 3rd of February 1940, when HMS Loinvar completed a mine-laying mission in winds strong enough to throw heavy spray across her decks. Her starboard engine had failed, leaving her at 6 knots. A German mine layer would have abandoned the sortie. The British crew kept going, counting the intervals by hand. The spacing of the field varied widely between 45 and 110 yards instead of the standard 72, but the field still worked. 3 German vessels struck mines in it over the following month. The British ferries were winning not because of superior design, but because they had been built to succeed in chaos. HMS Princess Maud proved the idea further on the 12th of March 1940 when she laid mines under direct enemy air observation. German reconnaissance aircraft circled overhead taking photographs, yet they still labeled her a transport and recommended no strike. Meanwhile, she continued deploying 180 mines undisturbed. German crews spent 14 months training for mine warfare. British ferry crews had only 72 hours of instruction. On paper, the Germans held every advantage. In practice, the British crews understood their own ships in ways no textbook had ever taught. The Germans expected complicated solutions. Britain used the simplest one possible and made it deadly. The incredible advantage of the converted ferries did not come from naval sophistication, but from the simple truth that their crews already knew every corner of the ships they sailed. Merchant sailors who had spent years working aboard these vessels stepped into war without needing long instruction. They knew which valves stuck in cold weather, which engines knocked under strain, which bearings overheated if pushed too hard. They understood the personality of each ship as if it were a living companion. This was something German naval doctrine could never replicate because German mine layers were standardized machines built for trained specialists, not familiar hands. Lieutenant William Cartwright, commander of HMS High, described this reality clearly in his April 1940 report. His chief engineer had served 7 years on the vessel before the war. He knew each pipe and fitting without consulting a manual. When the ship developed a knock in her starboard reduction gear at speeds above 13 knots, the chief already knew the solution. He ordered a reduction to 11.5 knots before the bearing overheated. No naval textbook would ever record these quirks. Only lived experience could. German crews trained for 14 months learning standardized procedures for vessels built to uniform specifications. British crews already carried years of practical knowledge before training even began. When HMS Manxman lost her wireless during a February 1940 operation, the crew simply used the commercial lamp signaling system they had relied on in years of peacetime service. A German crew would have aborted the mission. The British crew continued without hesitation because nothing about the situation was unfamiliar. They had operated the same vessel under those same conditions long before the war. What critics called inadequate training was in fact deeper expertise. The ships were the same, only the cargo had changed. This difference in mindset showed its power in the autumn of 1939. On the 21st of October, German S-boats fast attack craft attempted to raid British convoy routes in the Downs, the narrow stretch of water between the English coast and the Goodwin Sands. German intelligence had classified the area as clear. No mines charted, no defenses expected. 3 S-boats S-19, S-20, and S-21 entered at high speed, trusting the accuracy of their charts. The crews had no reason to doubt their intelligence. They believed they were moving through harmless water. But 4 days earlier, HMS Mona's Queen, a converted ferry, had laid 220 mines there in a pattern designed specifically to create a safe corridor for British shipping and to block fast attackers from approaching from the east. The minefield did not exist on any German chart. It existed only in reality, and reality hit them hard. S-19 struck a mine at 0, 142 hours, breaking her in 2. She sank in less than a minute. S-20 attempted to evade but struck another mine 2 minutes later, losing her stern in the blast. S-21 reversed direction at emergency speed and escaped, but her log-recorded waters completely blocked extensive minefield return route uncertain. The German flotilla commander filed a report stating that British defensive mining was far more widespread than intelligence had predicted. British intelligence later intercepted and decoded this assessment. The response was a quiet smile. The entire Downs region had been mined by one ferry in one operation, yet German commanders now believed the British had deployed a maze of minefields across the entire zone. In truth, most of those waters remained clear. It was the fear of mines, the uncertainty, that froze German operations. For nearly 3 months, German fast attack craft refused to enter the Downs at all. A single ferry had reshaped the operational map through one carefully placed field. That was only the beginning. Defensive mining fit within German expectations, but the offensive operations conducted by the ferries shocked German planners entirely. In April 1940, HMS Princess Victoria ventured deep into waters off the German-occupied Danish coast areas the Germans considered completely secured. To them, no British surface mine layer could possibly penetrate that far without detection or escort. Yet the Princess Victoria slipped through with ease because she looked exactly like a modest passenger ferry making an ordinary voyage. On the night of the 15th of April, she planted 180 mines along the Skagen shipping lane, the critical route for Swedish iron ore bound for German ports. The brilliance of the operation lay not in the number of mines, but in the precision of targeting. Instead of blocking the entire shipping lane, which would have caused an immediate alert, she ceded only the deep channel used by heavy ore carriers. Lighter vessels could safely pass through shallower waters. The Germans noticed ships disappearing but could not find a pattern. 3 ore carriers were lost in 12 days. German naval staff reviewed charts again and again, yet no explanation matched the evidence. Their war diary entry for the 28th of April 1940. Recorded continuing losses in Skagen approaches remain unexplained. Possible torpedo attacks from unidentified submarine recommend increased air patrols. They guessed at submarines, they guessed at torpedoes. They never considered mines because no mine layer had been sighted, no warship reported, no suspicious vessel logged. Only ferries had been observed, and ferries were harmless. The assumption was so strong it blinded them. German intelligence soon documented similar mysterious mining events in 17 different zones by June 1940. Their confusion grew with every incident. Mines appeared where no mine layers had been detected. Entire routes once considered safe seemed suddenly dangerous. The Admiralty had turned passenger ferries into ghosts that drifted through enemy waters unnoticed, leaving destruction behind without ever being recognized. German intelligence finally attempted to explain the impossible. In July 1940, they released an assessment concluding that Britain must be using submarines for offensive mining because no surface ships had been observed. They recommended increased anti-submarine patrols, sonar sweeps, and expanded listening posts. They were entirely wrong. British submarines played only a small role. The ferries played the largest. German planners simply could not accept that the vessels they ignored every day were the threats shaping the sea war. The misidentification became a trap the Germans built for themselves. Their anti-submarine efforts intensified in areas where no submarines operated, while ferries continued to move openly along shipping routes, mining them quietly under the noses of aircraft patrols and observation posts. HMS Loinvar alone completed 4 mine-laying missions that July in waters filled with German patrols. She was never detected. The ferries succeeded not by overpowering the enemy, but by slipping past their understanding. German captains began to fear the sea itself, not because mines were everywhere, but because they believed mines could be anywhere. By late 1940, the weight of British mining operations no longer rested solely on steel and explosives, but on something far more elusive, the creeping doubt spreading through every level of the German maritime command. Sea lanes that had been trusted for years were now questioned. Charts that once represented certainty became objects of suspicion. German merchant captains no longer viewed cleared routes as safe. They saw instead invisible British hands altering the water beneath them without warning. The power of the ferry conversions was no longer only the physical destruction they caused, but the mental pressure they imposed. This shift became vividly clear in the interrogation of a German merchant captain captured in September 1940 after his vessel struck a mine near the Dutch coast. He insisted that his crew had followed the assigned lane precisely. Naval authorities had guaranteed the route was swept every day. All protocols were followed, spacing, maintained, speed-regulated lookout posted. Yet the mine still found them in waters officially declared safe. His voice, recorded in the interrogation report, carried not anger but disbelief. If cleared lanes are mined, no, where is secure? The British can mine anywhere without detection. His words were not a complaint. They were an admission of strategic collapse. At that moment, Britain had achieved more than the sinking of a ship. They had destroyed trust in the German mapping system. This psychological effect became one of the most potent weapons of the ferry conversions. German intelligence reports from late 1940 are filled with confusion. They documented rising British mining activity fields appearing in unexpected places, ships lost in waters believed safe. Yet none of these reports identified the true cause. Not once did they name a ferry as a mine layer. They saw the results but not the method. They attempted to solve the problem through technical reasoning, and every conclusion they reached was wrong. What made the ferries more effective than purpose-built mine layers was precisely the quality that made them seem absurd in the first place: their simplicity. The German method required coordination between many moving parts. A typical mine layer like Kaiser depended on the bridge maintaining speed within half a knot, precise calculations by the plotting room, constant wireless communication, hydraulic systems staying at full pressure, and uninterrupted electrical power. One malfunction in the chain could compromise the entire mission. Escort ships were needed for protection, and each deployment required high-speed movement to reach the designated zones. The British method required almost none of this. A converted ferry such as HMS Minster needed only a single officer with a stopwatch, 4 men at the stern operating simple levers, 1 engineer coaxing the engines to steady output, and a handful of sailors following visual signals. No radios, no hydraulics, no advanced systems, no escort, no speed beyond the unremarkable 11 or 12 knots of a civilian ferry. The German system worked beautifully in calm seas in controlled tests in exercises designed to reflect ideal wartime conditions. The British system was designed for the opposite. It worked when conditions were broken, chaotic, unpredictable, and naval operations were almost always unpredictable. This distinction became clear in January 1940 when HMS Kalani laid a full minefield despite massive equipment failures. A storm had smashed her wireless antenna, leaving her without communication. Her compass showed wild deviations, so her captain navigated by dead reckoning and pre-war familiarity with the coastline he had traveled for 12 years. The engines shook with inconsistent rhythm, and visibility shifted from mist to darkness. Yet the field she dropped fell within 200 yards of the intended position. Over the next 6 weeks, 4 German ships struck mines in that exact field. German analysts later assumed the mines must have been placed by a highly advanced vessel with precision instruments. In truth, the accuracy came from a ferry captain who recognized headlands in the night because he had seen them for over a decade. The deeper irony of the entire program was that British naval doctrine had never planned on using deception. The conversions were meant simply to fill a gap. Britain lacked enough purpose-built mine layers and needed minefields immediately. Converting ferries was the fastest path available. The civilian appearance remained mostly because there was no time or budget for heavy modification. What began as an improvised solution slowly revealed itself as a perfect disguise. Only later did British naval intelligence understand what they had unintentionally created: a fleet of warships that the enemy could not perceive as warships. By early 1940, the Admiralty recognized the extraordinary advantage these vessels provided. Preservation of civilian appearance became official policy. New conversions were selected specifically for their unremarkable profiles. Orders were issued instructing commanding officers to maintain civilian behaviors patterns and silhouettes at all times. The deception had evolved from accident into strategy. Commander Ralph Fisher, who coordinated mine-laying operations from Portsmouth, wrote in March 1940 that the inability of the enemy to identify our converted vessels is proving more valuable than any technical capability a more military design might offer. A warship invites attack, a ferry invites disregard. By mid-1940, the accumulated effect of hundreds of ferry-laid mines had transformed German naval behavior. German routing protocols were rewritten. Transit times increased sharply as ships diverted far from established lanes. Scarce minesweepers were reassigned from offensive operations to continuous clearing tasks in waters that were often not mined at all. 23 coastal regions were designated suspected heavy mining zones in May 1940. 19 of those areas contained no British mines whatsoever. The ferries had created phantom minefields through unpredictability and invisibility. The result was paralysis. German vessels altered course for threats that did not exist, fearing dangers that had never been deployed. The psychological shadow cast by the ferries stretched farther than the mines themselves. The most valuable shipments to Germany, especially Swedish iron ore, experienced repeated disruptions, not because mines blocked the route in large numbers, but because captains no longer trusted any route, no matter how many assurances they received. Fear slowed what mines could not physically stop. In this way, the ferries achieved what fleets of advanced warships could not. They reshaped enemy behavior through uncertainty. The lesson was becoming clear. In naval warfare, strength did not always lie in armor guns or speed. Sometimes strength lay in being unseen. Britain had learned to weaponize the expectations of the enemy, and those expectations were now failing them at every turn. The offensive mining campaign of the ferry conversions reached its sharpest edge in the spring of 1940, when Britain began striking deep inside waters Germany believed firmly under its control. These were not defensive fields anymore. These were precision traps laid far from British shores in the pathways of German industry itself. HMS Princess Victoria became one of the most effective instruments of this phase. She had once carried families and luggage across the Irish Sea. Now she glided through hostile waters with the same calm profile she had shown in peacetime. On the night of the 15th of April 1940, she approached the Skagen shipping lane, the lifeline through which Swedish iron ore flowed into German foundries. The Germans monitored this route closely. They believed it secure, their charts listed it as clear. Their patrol schedules assumed only submarines posed a threat. No one expected a surface vessel to intrude, least of all a vessel that looked like a modest passenger ferry. Under cover of darkness, Princess Victoria released 180 mines, but the brilliance of the operation lay not in the quantity, but in the precision of placement. Instead of blocking the entire lane, she targeted only the deep water channel used by heavily laden ore carriers. These ships required depth. They could not maneuver into shallower water. By placing mines only where they would pass, Britain created a trap that was invisible not because it was hidden, but because it made perfect sense within the enemy assumptions. Lighter vessels continued to cross without issue, and that inconsistency convinced German analysts that the sinkings were random. In the 12 days that followed, 3 ore carriers vanished into the sea. Their loss rippled through the German war economy. Yet surveillance logs reported no enemy submarines, no torpedo trails, no warships. Only ferries and neutral traffic. German naval investigators studying the wrecks and shipping patterns could not find a coherent explanation. Mines made no sense to them because no mine layer had been seen. Their war diary entry of the 28th of April 1940 plainly recorded the confusion. Continuing losses in Skagen approaches remain unexplained. Possible torpedo attacks from unidentified submarine recommend increased air patrols. They were hunting the wrong enemy. The assumption that mines could not appear without a military vessel being sighted had become a fatal blind spot. And Princess Victoria was not the only ferry turning that blindness into a weapon. By June 1940, German naval intelligence had documented unexplained minefields in 17 different areas. What terrified them most was not the number of mines, but the impossibility of determining how the mines were being laid. They knew where submarines were. They monitored British warship movements. None of their known patterns matched the sudden appearance of mines. In response, German intelligence issued a revised assessment in July 1940. It concluded that Britain must be using submarines for offensive mining because there was no other explanation consistent with their understanding of mine warfare. They recommended heavier anti-submarine patrol sonar barriers and sweeping operations around areas of suspected submarine infiltration. The report was logical. It was also entirely incorrect. British submarines had laid only a small fraction of the fields in question. The ferries had laid the rest, moving openly across the horizon, while German lookouts dismissed them as harmless. This misidentification distorted German strategy at every level. Resources were diverted toward anti-submarine efforts where no submarines operated. Sonar nets were deployed in zones where mines had been placed from the surface, not from underwater. Patrol aircraft watched for periscopes, while ferries steamed peacefully past them at 11 knots. HMS Loinvar demonstrated the full advantage of this blindness in July 1940. She conducted 4 mine-laying operations in waters thick with German patrols hunting phantom submarines. The ferry's silhouette blended perfectly with neutral merchant vessels. She passed observation posts without raising suspicion and completed each sortie without a single challenge. The Germans were not failing to detect British vessels, they were failing to recognize them. The dominance of the ferries did not depend on their ability to hide, but on their ability to be seen and dismissed. The most powerful result of these operations was not the ships that sank, but the growing fear among German captains. By late summer, many no longer trusted cleared routes, even when sweepers had passed hours earlier. A mistrust that had begun quietly now spread through senior command channels. Safe passage became a term spoken with doubt rather than confidence. Captains began altering routes without orders, sailing far from standard lanes to avoid areas where they believed mines might be waiting. A disruption that required no fuel, no bombs, no escort vessels. It required only doubt. The testimony of merchant captains captured after their ships struck mines reflected a shared psychological collapse. Some spoke of lanes guaranteed safe suddenly erupting beneath them. Others remarked that British mines appeared to materialize where no vessel had been observed. Their voices described a world where the sea itself had become unreliable. This atmosphere altered not only German civilian, shipping, but military operations as well. Supply convoys slowed. Escorts stretched thinner. Minesweepers found themselves tasked with clearing areas that had never contained a single British mine. The shadow cast by the ferry conversions had become a strategic force shaping German behavior more effectively than the minefields physically could. Every explosion carried two impacts, one that tore through steel and one that tore through certainty. And it was the destruction of certainty that proved more devastating over time. By shaping perception, Britain achieved control over areas they never physically mined. German commanders began treating entire regions as lethal simply because mines had appeared nearby once before. In naval warfare, the unknown is often more dangerous than the known. The ferries had turned this principle into a weapon. Their mines did not need to be everywhere. They only needed to make Germany believe they could be anywhere. By the end of 1940, the seas themselves had become a kind of psychological battlefield in which every wave carried uncertainty for German sailors. What had begun as a practical British solution to a shortage of dedicated mine layers had grown into a strategic force shaping the movements, the fears, and even the doctrines of the enemy. German merchant captains spoke openly in interrogation rooms and in captured logs about the rising anxiety that gripped them each time they left harbor. They no longer believed their charts. They no longer trusted assurances from naval headquarters. They followed cleared routes, yet still imagined danger waiting beneath the surface. Every line on every map felt suspect. One German merchant captain captured after his ship was wrecked near the Dutch coast described his confusion with surprising clarity. He insisted that the voyage had followed the designated lane exactly. Naval authorities had promised the path was cleared daily and guaranteed safe. The lookouts were sharp, the spacing proper, the procedures followed without deviation. Yet the mine had found them anyway. His closing words summarized the state of German morale more effectively than any British report. If cleared lanes are mined nowhere is secure. The British can mine anywhere without detection. In that statement lay the essence of British success. The ferries had done far more than sink ships. They had destroyed the foundation on which German naval confidence rested. As German intelligence scrambled to explain these losses, they continued to misinterpret the cause. Reports from late 1940 speak of increased British mining, yet none mention ferries. Instead, analysts focused on theories that matched their expectations: fast mine layers, submarines, or destroyer units operating at night. They repeatedly recommended countermeasures suited for threats that did not exist while ignoring the threat that did. It was in this disconnect that the ferry conversions gained their greatest strength. The more the Germans misdiagnosed the situation, the stronger the British advantage became. What made the ferry conversions so effective was not merely that they worked, but that they worked when conditions were worst. Consider the comparison between a German purpose-built mine layer like Kaiser and a British ferry such as HMS Minster. Kaiser required a bridge crew keeping the vessel within half a knot of a precise speed. She needed a plotting room computing exact coordinates. She needed wireless communication intact. She needed hydraulic systems running at pressure. She needed electricity stable throughout deployment. She required escorts. She required speed. HMS Minster needed none of that. She needed one officer holding a stopwatch, 4 sailors at the stern gripping levers, a chief engineer coaxing the engines forward, and a series of silent visual signals. No escorts, no radios, no hydraulics, no advanced systems, just steady hands and familiar routines. This approach proved invaluable because war at sea rarely offered ideal conditions. Wind, rain, darkness, machinery, failure, and unexpected threats were constants. The British system thrived in chaos because chaos was the environment for which it had been built. A clear proof of this appeared in early January 1940 when HMS Colony undertook a mine-laying operation under conditions that would have forced any German vessel to abort. A storm battered her for hours, smashing her wireless mast. Her compass spun erratically, giving impossible readings. Her engines trembled with uneven force. Clouds hid the coastline and reduced visibility to shifting grey. Yet her captain had sailed that route in peacetime for 12 years. He recognized the shapes of headlands in brief flashes of moonlight. He counted the rhythm of the engines. He used dead reckoning and instinct where instruments failed. When she released her mines, the field formed within 200 yards of the planned pattern. Over the next 6 weeks, 4 German vessels struck mines in that same field. German analysts later concluded that the field must have been laid with advanced navigational equipment. They could not comprehend that a ferry had done it by experience alone. The true irony of the entire conversion program becomes clearer when tracing its origins. The Royal Navy did not originally intend for ferries to deceive the enemy. The conversions were born from shortage, not strategy. Britain simply needed mine-laying capacity faster than shipyards could provide it. Civilian vessels were available. They were converted quickly because there was no time for extensive modification. There was no desire to preserve a civilian disguise. It simply happened because the Navy could not afford anything else. Only later did intelligence officers begin to recognize the nature of what they had accidentally created. A fleet of military vessels invisible not through camouflage or stealth technology, but because they matched the exact shape of what enemy observers expected to be harmless. By early 1940, this insight had become crystallized into doctrine. Orders instructed converted ships to preserve their civilian appearance. New conversion candidates were chosen specifically for their ordinary silhouettes. Any modification that made them look too much like warships was discouraged. Commander Ralph Fisher articulated this new philosophy in a March 1940 memorandum. The enemy does not identify our converted vessels as mine layers. This is more valuable than any technical improvement we might make. A warship signals danger. A ferry signals nothing. This thinking transformed the operational landscape. By May 1940, German Naval Command had rewritten routing protocols to avoid entire zones labeled suspected heavy mining. 23 areas were flagged in these orders. 19 of them contained no mines at all. This was the triumph of perception over reality. British ferries had created phantom minefields by their unpredictable movements. German ships steered clear of regions that were empty simply because they could not be certain. The psychological effect extended far beyond the fields actually laid. Iron ore shipments slowed dramatically not because the routes were mined continuously, but because captains hesitated. Minesweepers were reassigned, constantly clearing waters that had never been touched. Escorts were stretched thin, responding to threats that did not exist. Britain had achieved operational influence far greater than the physical number of mines deployed. This shift demonstrated a deeper principle. In naval warfare, the most powerful weapon is often not the one that destroys steel, but the one that reshapes the enemy mind. The ferry conversions proved that invisibility could defeat strength. Deception could defeat engineering. Expectation could defeat doctrine. The British had turned civilian vessels into instruments that not only laid mines, but altered the very reality through which the enemy navigated. The ferries did not need to dominate the seas. They only needed to make the Germans doubt the seas themselves. The deeper the British ferry program advanced, the clearer, it became that its success had sprung not from meticulous planning, but from an improvised necessity that later revealed an unexpected brilliance. The Royal Navy had not initially set out to build a deceptive fleet. It had simply lacked purpose-built mine layers at the outbreak of war and needed a rapid solution. Civilian ferries were readily available and could be converted in days rather than months. Their modest structures were not altered dramatically because there was neither the time nor the resources to transform them. What began as a hurried response gradually evolved into one of the most effective deception strategies of the early war, a strategy that reshaped naval doctrine in ways few had imagined. The turning point arrived when British intelligence realized that the ferries went unnoticed, not despite their appearance, but because of it. A warship looks like a threat from miles away. A ferry looks like a stray passenger vessel, a harmless wanderer on the sea. The Germans saw exactly what the British allowed them to see. As this realization grew, the Admiralty shifted from accidental advantage to deliberate exploitation. By early 1940, orders were given to maintain the ferry's civilian silhouettes at all costs. New candidates for conversion were chosen for plain outlines, for the lack of military features, and for their ability to blend into commercial shipping lanes. Modifications that would reveal their military function were avoided. Everything depended on invisibility through familiarity. Commander Ralph Fisher captured this philosophy perfectly in a March 1940 directive when he wrote that the enemy inability to identify our converted vessels is more valuable than any technical capability such vessels might otherwise possess. His words signaled a profound shift in thinking. Naval tradition had long held that warships should look like warships' bold silhouettes bristling with weapons built to signal force. Yet the ferry program inverted this rule entirely. The less a ship looked like a weapon, the more effective it became. Weakness turned to strength, simplicity turned to sophistication, and invisibility became the sharpest blade. The results rippled through the German naval system. By May 1940, German routing protocols listed 23 coastal regions as suspected heavy mining zones, areas deemed too dangerous for regular transit. 19 of these zones contained no mines at all. The Germans were reacting not to what the British had done, but to what they believed the British could do. That distinction was crucial. It meant Britain achieved influence far beyond the physical mines laid. The ferry's ability to appear anywhere meant the Germans believed mines could be anywhere. This uncertainty forced them to reroute vessels to slower, indirect paths that stretched supply lines and exhausted escorts. It required them to deploy scarce minesweepers to areas that were never mined. It weakened convoy efficiency and slowed ore exports essential to German steel production. The British had discovered a way to create entire minefields without dropping a single mine. The phantom minefield became a psychological weapon. German naval command could no longer distinguish between what was real and what was possible. This confusion affected not just commercial shipping, but military operations as well. Fast attack craft avoided areas they once crossed confidently. Destroyers hesitated in waters thought to be compromised. Patrol boats slowed their routes uncertain of what lay beneath them. A single ferry operating unpredictably could influence decisions across an entire coastline. The German Navy had built its doctrine on the assumption that warships revealed themselves through design, through escort patterns, and through distinctive speeds. The ferry program shattered that assumption. A mine layer could now look exactly like an afternoon ferry from Dover, or a coastal steamer from the Isle of Man. This contradiction forced German analysts into a loop of misinterpretation. They continued searching for advanced vessels while the real threat moved quietly at 11 knots under a gray sky. The disruption extended to critical supply lines, most notably the iron ore shipments from Sweden. These shipments powered the German steel mills. The ferries did not need to block the entire route to cripple production. It was enough to create pockets of uncertainty, small clusters of mines that transformed trusted lanes into suspected kill zones. Captains stalled their departures, convoys required more escorts, Sweeping operations dragged on for days. The economic consequences multiplied even when only a handful of mines were physically present. The British thus achieved a strategic effect disproportionate to the resources invested. The ferries operated cheaply, quickly, and with minimal training. Their impact on German war planning was immense. The lesson became increasingly clear. Sophisticated technology mattered far less than the ability to manipulate enemy perception. A mine that is feared is sometimes more powerful than a mine that explodes. The psychological imprint of the ferry program never disappeared. German commanders struggled to adapt. They responded with heavy anti-submarine measures, even though submarines had little to do with the mystery minefields. They built theories around high-speed mine layers that did not exist. They proposed new reconnaissance protocols that failed to identify the ferries even when the aircraft photographed them directly. The deeper tragedy for the German Navy was that the truth was always visible. Photographs taken from reconnaissance aircraft in 1940 show ferries at sea during active mine-laying operations. In each image, the vessels appear as ordinary passenger ships, grey but familiar. German analysts saw the photographs, they studied them, they annotated them, and every time they reached the same conclusion. Civilian ferry, probable transport vessel, no military value. The British had achieved a level of deception so complete that the enemy looked directly at the answer yet never recognized it. The invisibility of the ferries was not created by camouflage or secrecy, but by the power of expectation. The Germans expected mine layers to look like warships. They expected advanced vessels to carry sophisticated equipment. They expected crews to be heavily trained specialists. They did not expect ferries converted in 11 days to outperform purpose-built craft that took 18 months to construct. And because they did not expect it, they did not see it. This failure shifted the balance of naval warfare in ways that would echo far beyond 1940. The ferry conversions had done more than lay mines. They had rewritten the rules by proving that strength is sometimes hidden in plain sight, and that the most dangerous vessel can be the one that appears harmless. By the end of their first year in operation, these ferries had become one of Britain's most effective maritime weapons, not by intimidating the enemy, but by quietly dismantling their confidence in everything they believed about the sea. By the close of 1940, the ferry conversion program had grown far beyond its humble origins, transforming nearly 50 civilian vessels into auxiliary mine layers that operated with an effectiveness no naval planner had predicted. These converted ships laid a staggering total of 87,650 mines by the end of the year, a number that dwarfed the output of Britain's purpose-built mine layers. The ferries accounted for 64% of all British mines deployed in 1940, yet none of them looked like instruments of war. None carried the heavy silhouettes or recognizable structures of naval craft. Instead, they glided across the water, appearing as nothing more than the same ferries that once shuttled passengers through peaceful channels. Their strength came from being overlooked. Their greatest victories came from being ignored. In those months, no converted ferry was lost to enemy action. Not one. They sailed through enemy-controlled waters under observation from patrol aircraft and coastal lookouts. Yet they were never targeted because the Germans never understood what they truly were. Meanwhile, the purpose-built mine layers, HMS Adventure and HMS Abdiel, magnificent vessels, equipped with advanced hydraulic rails, and staffed by trained naval crews, operated under constant threat. They required heavy escorts. They were tracked by reconnaissance. They laid only 12,400 mines combined in the same period. Their very identity as warships limited their effectiveness. Visibility became their weakness. The ferries, by contrast, operated invisibly through their ordinariness. They laid 7 times as many mines as the purpose-built craft while moving casually through contested waters. Their disguised presence created a web of danger that the Germans could not chart or counter. The ferry program exposed a flaw at the heart of German and indeed global naval doctrine. Military planners had assumed that technological superiority and overt military strength defined effectiveness. Yet the early months of the war revealed a far different truth. The most powerful tool was often the one the enemy did not recognize as a weapon. The ferries were living proof. To German observers, a ferry was a ferry. No further analysis seemed necessary. Their profiles inspired no suspicion. Their speeds matched commercial traffic. Their decks lacked visible armament. Their wakes followed the quiet patterns of ordinary vessels. Everything about them reassured the enemy. This reassurance hid a devastating capability. The Germans never created a framework for identifying civilian-appearing vessels as deliberate threats. Their naval intelligence notes captured in 1945 show reconnaissance photos of British ferries taken during actual mine-laying operations. Yet beside these photos, analysts wrote labels such as civilian ferry or transport vessel or probable hospital ship. These conclusions were not careless mistakes. They reflected an institutional mindset. The Germans believed mine layers would resemble mine layers. They believed sophisticated operations required sophisticated ships. They believed complexity signaled capability. The ferries broke each of these assumptions silently and completely. This disconnect allowed Britain to achieve a strategic effect disproportionate to its resources. Mines alone did not sink 263 German ships, nor damage 187 more. They also created doubt, hesitation, and fear that weakened German operations at every level. As the ferries continued their missions, German naval planners scattered their forces widely in response to threats they could not pinpoint. They increased sweeping operations. They enforced new routing restrictions. They devoted aircraft to patrol areas based on phantom patterns. They reduced convoy speed. All of these actions consumed time, fuel, and manpower, while Britain invested only minimal resources into its ferry crews and simple deployment systems. The ferries operated cheaply, they operated reliably, they operated invisibly. Their simplicity was not a flaw but a weapon. Even their crews, drawn largely from merchant service, proved more suited to chaotic wartime conditions than highly trained specialists. These sailors had lived on their vessels for years. They understood every sound and vibration. They navigated by instinct when instruments failed. They fixed machinery with improvisation when spare parts were unavailable. They knew how to coax a wounded engine to keep turning. This intimate knowledge ensured the ferries could complete missions under conditions where any purpose-built vessel would have turned back. Working with simple mechanical levers and basic rails, these crews managed missions that required nothing more than timing, discipline, and familiarity. Their expertise was practical, not theoretical. Their training in war was minimal, yet their performance excelled because they were operating ships they already knew deeply. By remaining ordinary, the ferries became extraordinary. Their invisibility came not from hiding, but from fitting perfectly into the expectations of the enemy. German analysts looked at them again and again and saw only what they expected to see. When a reconnaissance aircraft photographed HMS Mona's Queen, or HMS Princess Victoria, or HMS Loinvar, the images showed no threatening lines, no heavy guns, no armored hull. They showed ferries with grey paint and simple forms. The analysts annotated them without imagining that they were watching minefields being created beneath the surface. They had all the evidence, yet they reached the wrong conclusions every time. The true brilliance of the ferry conversions lay not in their mechanical systems or mine-carrying capacity, but in the failure of enemy recognition. Germany had built doctrine around the belief that a threat must reveal itself through form. Britain proved the opposite. The ferries taught the Royal Navy a profound lesson that shaped future operations. Effectiveness does not always come from complexity. Camouflage does not always require concealment. A vessel can operate in plain sight and still remain unseen. What matters is not what the ship is, but what the enemy believes it to be. When the Germans searched for warships, Britain sent them ferries. When they searched for submarines, Britain sent surface vessels disguised as harmless traffic. When they sought sophistication, Britain deployed raw simplicity and made it lethal. In the end, the ferry conversion program became one of the most quietly decisive innovations of the early war. Its success came from shaping the enemy's perception, turning their expectations into vulnerabilities. It showed that the greatest power in naval warfare sometimes lies not in overwhelming force, but in the ability to move invisibly through the blind spots of the enemy. The ferries proved that a vessel need not look dangerous to change the course of a campaign. They were overlooked, they were underestimated, and because of that they won. If you want more forgotten war stories told with truth, grit, and no filters, subscribe now. Your support keeps these missions alive.